Today we're starting Unit 2, Notes number 5, Improving America. So for this past unit, we've been looking at changes in America because of industrialization, and also identifying a lot of problems in terms of how workers are treated, the business structure, immigrants in the city. So as these problems become apparent, we're now going to look at some of the solutions that people were trying to implement. So the notes today, Improving America. Don't forget, we're going to have a key term quiz on Tuesday that will include key terms from these notes and notes number 6. So Americans are eager to fix social problems to make U.S. a model society. Reforms of the Gilded Age carry over into the 20th century. There's a drive to reform big business and working conditions. Intellectuals seek to make government more responsive. The result is the progressive movement. So when you see the word progressive, you want to think progress, improvement. So this whole progressive movement is all about improving different areas of our life. So the progressive movement it's a period from about the 1870s to 1910s that aimed to return control of the government back to the common people, to restore equal economic opportunity, and correct social injustices. So 3 main goals of progressivism. You want to make sure you know these 3 areas. Almost all of the progressive laws, progressive changes can be put into one of these categories. Promote moral improvement in society, eliminate corruption in government, and improve working conditions nationwide. So some of the early activists within the movement. So muckrakers. Muckrakers were journalists who wrote about the corruption of big business and life, often caused backlash against big businessmen, wealthy, and corporate greed. So ultimately, these journalists wanted to expose the problems. They wanted to make other people aware of it. Also wanted to make the government aware about what was happening. So the journalists could be writing for newspapers. You would also have muckrakers that would write novels. So one example was The Jungle. In 1906, it was written by Upton Sinclair as a way to expose the harsh working conditions that the immigrants were part of. And so he focused on a meat packing plant in Chicago. So even though his purpose was to expose the working conditions, people were more outraged by the conditions of the meat. So we'll probably read an excerpt about this in class. In The Jungle, some of the things that Upton Sinclair describes is that oftentimes the meat was spoiled, and so instead of throwing out the meat, it was often covered up by adding more flavoring or seasoning and then like repackaging it. Oftentimes the meat would be ground up with rats that were in the building, so just completely unsanitary practices. So you can see why people were upset about this. People began to write to the government to investigate about these allegations. So guarding consumer health. And so another thing we see in this era is that the government begins to take more responsibility in terms of protecting its citizens. So in 1906, Teddy Roosevelt was president, and he signs the Meat Inspection Act. This mandates strict cleanliness in meat plants, set up a meat inspection system. So you look at the picture, you see the men in the white coats. They are part of the butchers, but they're also going to be inspecting the meat. And so there's a whole process of them having to be, wear gloves and have to inspect the meat and to make sure it is safe for people to eat, or else they could get sick. So began with the Meat Inspection Act, they began to go after food and drug industry that were not following these practices. Teddy Roosevelt signs the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. This required truth in labeling, banned the sale of contaminated food and drugs. And so this ensures that when someone's saying that this meat is sausage or it's beef, that it is actually what they're claiming it to be. Because that was one thing the meat company was doing, was claiming it was one part of the animal when it really wasn't. And so both of these laws are still enacted today, Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. So the political machine. So these reforms are going to focus more on government. So political machine is an organized group of political officials who controlled activities of a political party within a city. So the actual political machine, these are not politicians, but they're people that are hoping to gain an advantage by having a say, having control over a political party or the people that are in political office. So with migration, immigration, urbanizations, political parties sought to take advantage of the chaos and control the office. How? They would often manipulate voters. So officials would give out favors and perks to voters and businesses in return for support at the ballots. So you get my back, I get yours. Businesses that would support political candidates would often be rewarded by being given contracts, construction contracts or doing work for the city. So made sure that the businesses or people would in turn would continue to support these politicians, or they could be offered jobs. So it wasn't a very good system. So the political machine structure. So one thing to remember, the political machine is not the candidate. It's not the actual political office. This is like a separate entity whose goal is to control the mayor, the city council, so that way they can pass decisions that are favorable to them. They have something to gain. So this shows just the hierarchy of that political machine. So it structures like a pyramid. On the bottom, you have your block captains and precinct workers. They round up votes in the neighborhoods and city blocks. They escort voters to the ballot box. They're going to have the connection to the people. They're the ones that go out, round everybody up, make the offers, possibly intimidate people, and then they report to the ward bosses. The ward bosses give out local favors, ensure precinct votes are secured, so they kind of control certain areas. Beneath them are the block captains, the precinct workers, and at the very top is the city boss. And so they control local services. They choose the candidate to elect. They're the one that's getting the bribes, making money off of this whole system. So next, let's look a little more closely at this. So the machine structure. So you have the city boss on top. They select a candidate for public office, a candidate that's going to be sympathetic to them, pass laws that favor them, or don't pass laws that favor them. Primarily, they're looking to make money, want to control who gets assigned, construction jobs, contracts from the city. So city boss will oversee jobs, housing, citizenship, courts, perks. When new immigrants are coming into the city, they can say, hey, we can help you by fast tracking your citizenship because we know people at City Hall because they fund campaigns and those candidates essentially work for the city boss. So below the city boss are the ward bosses. Then they have their block captains, and at the very bottom are the the voters. And so this whole system is corrupt because it's not on the basis of voters voting for a candidate who's going to make change and improve things for the city. It's just about people wanting to make money and have power. So when people see political machines, they want to try to fix it. And so this is what the progressive movement is about, seeing problems and improving them. So the influence of machines. Political machines preyed on newly arrived immigrants and struggling businesses the most. How it worked. It took advantage of the culture shock that immigrants experienced, promised them housing, jobs, quick naturalization for worried new immigrants. Oftentimes hired second-generation immigrants to speak to the newbies in their native language. Businesses could get quick licenses and bypass paperwork. Possibly get their competitors to disappear in return for cash bribes or votes. So here's examples of real political machines: Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall. So this is the most famous political machine in New York City during this time. It was located at Tammany Hall. It was run by Boss Tweed, and it was a Democratic political machine, and ultimately ran New York. So you see this political cartoon here says, "Under the thumb, the boss." Well, what are you going to do about it? So signifying that this guy controlled everything that happened in the city. And sometimes it meant that certain laws were passed, certain improvements weren't made. So these negative cartoons began to appear. These were made by Thomas Nast, and so began to expose, he would be considered a muckraker, began to kind of expose the corruption, the injustice that was happening. So outrage over Tammany's graft led to its downfall. Tweed was eventually arrested and convicted of fraud. It was estimated that Tweed defrauded New York out of tens of millions of dollars in kickbacks. So money that should have went to the city, that could have went to the city to make new construction and improvements, instead went to his pocket. So again, corruption. So yes, he got arrested, this was done, but what's going to stop somebody else from assuming that role? And so we will talk about in the next set of notes some of the improvements that are made in terms of elections, trying to make elections more fair, and trying to eliminate the intimidation factor that would go into elections. So we're done with these notes. Make sure to do your summary. Make sure to look back over for any key terms that we covered.